Okay, good. We've hit 100 already. So my name is Stephanie Ayurom Akruma, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's session. I'm here with esteemed panelists I know you would love and understand and learn from today. But before we continue, I must tell you something about today's webinar. This webinar is a 5-part series, and this is the first of 5. What we intend to do today is to be able to build capacity and engage young people from the various parts of the world and create an understanding of the terminologies and main issues that have to do with climate change, with the focus on the nexus between industry and innovation. This webinar has been brought to you especially by the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO. It's brought to you by the Climate Parliament. It's also brought to you by Egypt's National Institute of Governance and Sustainable Development. We are also supported by SDG 7 Youth Constituency and YOUNGO. We hope that by the time we are done with this 5-part series, we'll be able to create awareness on your own, take your own climate action in your respective parts of the world. Before I go on, I must briefly tell you what I, as a person, may have been or may have not been able to do to be able to host this webinar and moderate this with you here. So I work as a project development and economic impact director at the Center for Green Growth that focuses on climate change adaptation, circular economy, and energy in Africa. I was a 2021 climate ambassador representing Ghana with the GYCN of the World Bank Group. I have been involved with UNICEF as a climate activist. I worked for the GIZ at some point, and I served with some environmental friendly company boards. And I hope that I'll be able to do justice to this moderation for you so that you can take action of your own. I will not spend too much time. I must first introduce to you our opening speaker. Our first opening speaker is Dr. Sharifa Fouad Sharif. She's a tenured professor of public administration at the Faculty of Economics and Political Science at the Cairo University. Dr. Sharif has held positions of Vice Dean for Environment and Community Service, as well as chairperson of the Public Administration Department at Future University in Egypt. She headed the Public Administration Research and Consultation Center at the Faculty of Economics and Political Science at the Cairo University for 3 consecutive years. She has been teaching for almost 20 years in public administration, management, corporate social responsibility, social sustainable development, social entrepreneurship, environmental management, governance, and gender development. Dr. Sharif is currently the Executive Director of the National Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. Dr. Sharif was previously the Executive Director of the National Management Institute and the head of the Governance Center at the Ministry of Planning, Monitoring and Administration Reform in Egypt, alongside being the governance advisor to the Minister of Planning, Monitoring and Administrative Reform. She also serves on several ministerial committees in Egypt. Among them are the Administration Reform, Civil Service Capacity Building, Egyptian Government Excellence Award, Egyptian Anti-Corruption Committee, and so much more. Dr. Sharif is currently a member of the Committee of Experts on Public Administration under the UN Economic Social Council. He's also the lead in the Bridging Gender Digital Divide Initiative with the UNDP and Cisco, which was launched in 2021. She has earned both her Bachelor's of Arts degree in Public Administration and a Master's degree in Public Administration from the American University in Cairo. Dr. Sharif was a Chevening Scholar and has received a degree of doctorate in philosophy in environmental management and public policy from the University of Sussex. She has published so many research papers, articles, and co-authored in national international journals. She was granted Best Paper Award. I can keep going up about Dr. Sharif because her profile keeps going and going. But Dr. Sharif was selected as one of the top 50 women who are influential in Egypt for her significant contributions to the social, economic, and development sectors in Egypt. please, if you are not convinced yes, that this person is a remarkable person to talk to you on this topic, please welcome Dr. Sherif to give us a welcome remarks. Thank you, Dr. Sherif, and please go on.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for your kind words, and I think I should have gave you a shorter bio. It's my bad. Welcoming you all, and on behalf of Her Excellency Dr. Hala Saeed, Minister of Planning, and in collaboration, of course, with the National Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development, and partnering up with UNIDO to launch today's 5-series webinar on empowering youth for COP27. And this, of course, is in preparation of Egypt's role in participating in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh next in November. So we have been working on creating awareness on several initiatives, including the Ambassadors for Sustainable Development and Ambassadors for Climate Change. And I think the majority of participants today are from these initiatives. So I'm welcoming them, a warm welcome to all of them. They have been selected according to a very rigorous criteria, and they have exceeded and excelled in the program and are considered or authorized by the Ministry of Planning and the Institute as certified trainers for sustainable development and climate change. So today, as Stephanie was telling us, we are introducing a 5-webinar series on empowering youth and climate change, creating awareness on different topics, technical topics related to climate change. And as we all know, of course, youth are our future, and working closely and together with them is the only way to a sustainable future for all of us. So we have to work together. It's a collective effort, working together hand in hand on creating a better future for all of us on the planet. So I'm welcoming you all to a very important series of webinars on creating awareness on climate change and the nexus related to it. And I wish you all the best of luck. And we'll be together every Thursday at 11. So I'm wishing you all a very fruitful series of webinars, very informative. And again, our slogan with and the youth component as a institute is to educate and empower youth on climate change. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Sherif. So our next speaker will give us a few words as well, on a few remarks on our particular webinar. So our next speaker is an Egyptian diplomat with the rank of ministerial plenipotentiary, born in Cairo. He is currently holding the position of a deputy permanent representative of Egypt to the United Nations and international organizations in Vienna. Previously, he was the director of the International Cooperation Directorate at the Egyptian Ministry of Planning and Administrative Reform, while also being a member of the board of directors of the Grand Egyptian Museum, preceded by the position of Chief of the European Union Affairs Department. In the Egyptian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he served in 4 postings as a diplomat in Ireland, Romania, Ecuador, and Austria. Mr. Zaki has a bachelor degree from the Faculty of Economics and Political Science from the Cairo University, where he majored in political science with a minor in economics. He also has a master's degree from the Mediterranean Academy for Diplomatic Studies from the University of Malta. He currently holds the position of Deputy Chair of the Industrial Development Board of the United Nations Organizations for Industrial Development. Please help me welcome Mr. Hazim Zaki. Thank you, Mr. Hazim.
Thank you, Stephanie, very much. Well, good morning to everyone. It is my honor and pleasure to be with you today representing the permanent mission of Egypt to the United Nations in Vienna as Chargé d'Affaires ad interim in this series of important seminars. And I would like to especially to thank Dr. Sharifa Sharif, the Executive Director of the National Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development, Mr. Tariq Mtaira, Director of the Department of Energy at the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, and the Climate Parliament for having their institutions arrange these important and timely sessions that precede the holding of the upcoming COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh next November. Now, allow me to say a few words in Arabic about the importance of this event, as it is the language of the audience and my cherished native language. السيدات والسادة، في البداية أود أن أتقدم بخالص الشكر والامتنان إلى المعهد القومي للحوكمة والتنمية المستدامة ومنظمة اليونيدو وبرلمان المناخ على الدعوة الكريمة إلى إلقاء كلمة افتتاحية في هذا الحدث الهام الموجه للشباب لتوعيتهم وتعريفهم ببعض الموضوعات المتعلقة بقضية تغير المناخ استعدادا لعقد مؤتمر تغير المناخ COP27 بمدينة شرم الشيخ في شهر نوفمبر القادم. سيدات والسادة، أن مصر يهمها أن تستضيف هذا المؤتمر نيابة عن القارة الأفريقية، حيث يأتي انعقاده في توقيت هام للغاية وفي مرحلة بالغة الدقة، فالعالم يشهد تحديات في منتهى الخطورة رغم النجاح الكبير في التعافي من جائحة فيروس كورونا كوفيد-19. ففي الوقت الذي يواجه فيه العالم أزمة اقتصادية كبيرة، فإن التفاعلات العالمية الراهنة وأبرزها الحرب في أوكرانيا قد فاقمت التحديات الخاصة بالأمن الغذائي وأمن الطاقة على نحو يؤثر بشدة على الدول النامية والأقل نمواً. ورغم هذه التحديات الملموسة، فإن التقدير هو أنها قابلة للحل خلال المدى القصير أو المتوسط في أسوأ الأحوال، وذلك على عكس تحديات تغير المناخ وأثره البالغ على تقدم الحضارة الإنسانية، أو على الأقل أثره في عدم تدهورها إلى الدرجة التي يصعب التغلب عليها بسرعة مناسبة، أخذا في الاعتبار أن معالجة آثار تغير المناخ قد تستغرق عقودا طويلة من الزمان. وفي هذا الصدد فإن مصر تسعى خلال دورة مؤتمر تغير المناخ هذا العام في شرم الشيخ على ضرورة التركيز بشكل أكبر على تنفيذ كافة التعهدات السابقة وإيجاد السبل العملية لتطبيقها بدلا من التركيز فقط على تقديم تعهدات جديدة. ويشمل ذلك ما تم الاتفاق عليه بشكل خاص في اتفاقية باريس وخلال دورة المؤتمر الأخيرة COP26 التي عقدت العام الماضي في مدينة غلاسكو. هذا وتتطلع مصر إلى إعداد أجندة متكاملة في كافة المجالات المرتبطة بتغير المناخ خلال المؤتمر، وستسعى في هذا الإطار مع الدول النامية إلى التأكيد مجددا على أهمية توفير التمويل اللازم على المستوى الدولي بما يمكنها من القيام بمشروعات للتكيف مع الآثار السلبية للتغيرات المناخية وتقليل آثارها. ومن ضمن الأمور الحيوية التي سيتم السعي إلى تحقيقها هي متابعة التشديد على أهمية العمل على نقل التكنولوجيا للمجتمعات النامية والتي تمكنها من الإسراع في الوصول إلى الحياد الكربوني، وذلك من خلال توفير تكنولوجيا وتعريف بالتطبيقات العملية، بالإضافة إلى التدريب ورفع المهارات وتقديم نوعية جديدة من التعليم مثل التعليم الفني الذي يتعلق بالتخفيف من والتكيف مع ظاهرة تغير المناخ. وكل هذا سوف يعمل على الإسراع بالعمل المناخي بشكل متكامل. وأن المهم في هذا السياق أن ندرك جميعا أن تحقيق أهداف المؤتمر والوصول إلى الغايات النهائية لن يتم دون انخراط أو مشاركة كاملة من جميع الأطراف الذين هم جميعا أصحاب مصلحة في هذا الصدد، ويشملون إلى جانب الدول والحكومات الشركات الخاصة والمجتمع المدني والمجتمع العلمي والنشطاء والأوساط الأكاديمية، وكذلك الشباب الذين يجب أن يكونوا المدافعين الرئيسيين عن هذه القضية في ظل تداعياتها المحتملة على مستقبلهم. وفي هذا الصدد تؤكد مصر على دور الشباب في زيادة الوعي وتقديم الحلول المبتكرة ولا سيما عبر المبادرات التي يقودها الشباب بما في ذلك ريادة الأعمال والتي تساهم في العمل المناخي وتعمق من فرص تمكينه. وبالتالي سيشهد COP27 مشاركة موسعة من جميع الأطراف مع إيلاء أهمية خاصة لعرض قصص النجاح والتعريف بالمشروعات الصغيرة والمتوسطة المرتبطة بمجال المناخ والتي يتم تنفيذها في كافة المجالات للتعرف على كيفية تأثيرهم وتأثيرها بالتغيرات المناخية، كما سيتم التعريف بأنماط المشروعات التي تؤدي إلى تطوير السياسات على المستوى الوطني بما يمكن من دعم التحول في مجال الطاقة وتشجيع الاستثمار في هذا المجال. واتصالا بما تقدم وقبل أن أختتم أود الإشارة إلى أن البعثة الدبلوماسية المصرية في فيينا تعمل مع جميع المنظمات الدولية العاملة في النمسا بما فيها بالطبع منظمة الأمم المتحدة للتنمية الصناعية من أجل المشاركة الفعالة في المؤتمر وتنظيم فعاليات والدفع بمبادرات يكون لها تأثير إيجابي على المستوى الدولي. ومن أبرز الملفات التي سيتم التعاون بصددها سيكون المبادرات الخاصة باستخدام الهيدروجين الأخضر الذي يمثل بارقة أمل لمستقبل آمن بيئيا يوفر أمن الطاقة ويضمن عدم التأثير سلبيا على التوازن المناخي الدقيق والذي تأثر كثيرا في العقود الماضية جراء استخدام البشرية لمصادر الطاقة التقليدية التي أدت إلى الوضع الراهن الذي نتحسن منه جميعا. أشكركم على حسن الاستماع. Thank you very much for allowing me to say the words in Arabic, but I thought it would be very important for me as representing Egypt, and as Arabic is one of the United Nations language, to say the words that I wanted to say about the importance of the Sharm el-Sheikh conference, COP27, in Arabic to reach the audience directly. So I appreciate very much this opportunity, and thank you very much and best of luck.
Thank you, Mr. Hazim Zaki, very much for your presentation. Our next speaker is
Stephanie, you are muted.
Thank you very much, Tariq. Our next speaker is the very person who just mentioned that I am muted. Our very own Mr. Tariq M. Tyra of UNIDO. He is the director of the energy department at UNIDO. His work experience spans over 22 years in developed and emerging economies. He joined UNIDO, and prior to that, he worked as a senior research fellow at the International Institute of Industrial and Environmental Economics at the Lund University in Sweden. He has a PhD in Industrial and Environmental Economics from the Lund University. He also has a master's degree in Environmental Management and Policy, a diploma in engineering from the Tokyo Institute of Technology in Japan, a bachelor's degree in engineering as well, and also one in material science. He likes to keep his profile very brief. So please help me welcome Mr. Tariq M. Tyra, who's going to give us the very special keynote we've been waiting for.
Thank you, Stephanie. Pleasure to meet you, Hazem and Sharifa. Young change makers and leaders, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really very pleased to join you today at this inaugural webinar of the series entitled Empowering Youth for COP27, Inspiring Climate Action. UNIDO is certain that young women and men will play a key role in driving industrial and economic transformations, which are crucial to achieve our ambitious climate goals. And we are therefore delighted to co-organize this webinar series alongside the National Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development, the Climate Parliament, the Young Constituency of the UNFCCC, YOUNGO, and the SDG7 Youth Constituency. You, the young generation of today, unfortunately are burdened with the knowledge and responsibility to act for a dreadful state of the environment that, to the most part, is not of your making. When I started my engineering education in the mid-1980s, we left school without any foundations on the impact we are causing with our modern industrial systems and society. I studied, as Stephanie mentioned, industrial materials, but the word sustainable or sustainable industry was rather a strange concept. I have to say that the most profound and transformative experience for me personally was at mid-career when I attended a course 10 years into my work on human-induced impact on our natural environment. That experience has changed the way I relate to my profession and most importantly, also everyday life, but also, I think looking positively, it also opened endless possibilities to act. So we hope that this webinar series will give you not only good foundations to get involved in the upcoming conference of the parties, as Hazem mentioned, taking place in Sharm el-Sheikh, but also inspire and guide you how to get your hands dirty and take action. As mentioned, we are not on track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Neither do our actions that are necessary to tackle climate crisis meet the ambitions. We need the voice of young in all discussions and at all negotiation tables. We need your voice so that you can shape our future and jointly take urgent actions toward climate justice. At today's webinar and during next months, you will learn from outstanding experts about climate action, as well as different related themes, such as sustainable energy transition, innovation, climate justice, gender equality, and the role of youth. Today, the focus is on understanding the reason for climate change and its impacts, the Paris Agreement, climate justice and climate finance, as well as the role of Africa in climate action ahead of COP27. At UNIDO, we can see that youth already play a significant role in driving sustainable energy transformation and climate action by applying innovative technologies and business models to respond to the demands of the future. I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you in this webinar series. We are here to learn from one another, inspire each other, and ultimately take action. Therefore, I'm anticipating great discussion and a spark of inspiration. وكلمة بالعربي برحب فيكم جميعا وبطلع إلى حوار جميل معكم وعميق مع كل الزملاء والزميلات المشاركين من مصر الحبيبة ومن كل المناطق في العالم. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Tariq. So now we're going to get into the meat of our matter. Our very first speaker is Mr. Corner Barry. He's going to give us key concepts on international climate politics. But first, let me introduce him properly. Mr. Corner Barry is responsible for the UNFCCC Secretariat's engagement with non-party stakeholders. This includes formal admission of observer organizations to UNFCCC processes. He supports the high-level champions for climate action and tracking of non-party climate action and oversight of the ACE and gender work streams. Over the past 20 years, he has played a leading role in the development of international climate change regulatory framework, including the coordination of the drafting of our very own Paris Agreement and the launch of the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action. Corner has played a significant role in the development of the international infrastructure to support market solutions to climate change through developing the initial EU Emissions Trading Directive and a decade of direct support to the implementation of the Kyoto Protocol's Clean Development Mechanism. Please help me welcome Mr. Barry Corner. Mr. Corner, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you to the organizers for starting this series of webinars, and UNIDO and the Climate Parliament and the other organizers. I think this is an excellent initiative to engage a broader range of stakeholders in the COP process, in the climate process more generally, in understanding what the COP can do to drive climate action, but how climate action also takes place outside of the COP. And I think it's critically important that we view both of those elements. The intergovernmental process and the multilateral process creates an international framework, but the action on climate change needs to be taken domestically, locally, and individually. And all of the work that youth delegates will do, both as negotiators, as activists, and as contributors to climate action, is critical both at that intergovernmental level in keeping pressure on governments and the intergovernmental process to strive for the highest level of ambition and ensure that the goals of the Paris Agreement are kept alive, and also ensuring that is delivered at a domestic level. So youth really create the connection between that intergovernmental process and the future that we really want to deliver and the action taken domestically. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of the intergovernmental structure and then touch on some of the aspects of youth engagement in the UNFCCC process and how youth can contribute more broadly to climate action. And hopefully technology works for us today. And that this is now visible to you. Okay, great. So for those that don't know the institutional kind of structure, the Paris Agreement aims to implement the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was adopted in 1992 and in force since 1994. So we're celebrating 30 years, or maybe commemorating 30 years, not fully celebrating, as not all aspects of the convention have been fully implemented, and we still see that emissions continue to rise. And the overall objective of the UNFCCC convention is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. And the Paris Agreement in pursuing that objective, aims to hold the increase in average global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and pursue efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5 Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Since the Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015 and entered into force in 2016, the IPCC had been requested in 2015 to also produce an assessment of 1.5 degrees. A special report on 1.5 came out in 2017, and I guess it's clear from that that a 1.5 degree temperature increase is a dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. We're already experiencing that around the world today. Average temperature increases between 1.1, 1.3 degrees that we've already experienced. We're seeing that in extreme weather conditions, in excessive heat, and in drought and other impacts of climate change on vulnerable communities. So we're really tackling very much at the edge here of ensuring that this original objective that was established in 1992 to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system, we're really on the borderline of achieving that. And so Paris is not, must be viewed in that sense. It's really the last line of defense against this interference in the climate system, which is a common base for all humanity, and the basis on which the planet is livable for humanity, and which the human species has thrived over the last 10,000 years and more. So what are those long-term goals of the Paris Agreement? Is, as said, limiting temperature increase to well below 2 degrees, pursuing 1.5. It was further strengthened in Glasgow, acknowledging that increase beyond 1.5 would have significant risks and implications for humanity. It's aiming to achieve a balance of emissions and removals by sources in the second half of the century, which achieving that, if we're going to get that net zero in the second half of the century, and IPCC 1.5 report indicates that would need to be by 2050, which also results or needs to ensure rapid reductions in emissions between now and 2030. The Paris Agreement decision that adopted the Paris Agreement acknowledged that a reduction in aggregate emissions by 2030 would need to be down to 40 gigatons. Again, the IPCC 1.5 and the 6th assessment report, which is just being released over the last 6 months or so, indicates again that this results in a need to ensure halving of emissions by 2030. So all parties have committed to limiting their aggregate long-term emissions to achieve these long-term goals, and those commitments are expressed both through nationally determined contributions, NDCs, and long-term low-emission development strategies. And essentially, what we have in the Paris is a bottom-up commitment by individual countries to contribute to that collective goal. The elements of the Paris Agreement to achieve that target, the long-term temperature goal, a global peaking in climate neutrality by mid-century. There are voluntary cooperation mechanisms and market and non-market approaches inscribed in Article 6. A global goal for adaptation inscribed in Article 7. Recognition of the need to address loss and damage from the impacts of climate change in a cooperative and collective manner. And provisions in relation to the provision of finance, technology, and capacity building support. We also have provisions on climate change education, training, and public awareness, public participation, and the public access to information, which we term as Action for Climate Empowerment, and transparency and climate and compliance regimes for the Paris Agreement. So how do these NDCs work under the Paris Agreement? Is a global response indicated first. So we need to have a commitment that's on the aggregate level across the world will result in us achieving the 1.5 target, but also ensuring that the world is resilient and vulnerable communities are resilient to the impacts that we will be experiencing at 1.5. Those impacts are greater than the impacts we're already feeling today, and which vulnerable communities are not resilient to currently. And also requires aligning all financial flows with achieving of those dual targets of having those emission reductions consistent with 1.5, but also having vulnerable communities be resilient to the expected impacts of a 1.5 rise in temperatures. All parties are requested to take efforts in line with those articles on mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology, capacity building, and transparency, all with a view to achieving the purpose of the Paris Agreement. And efforts of all individual parties are expected to progress over time. So no backsliding in the commitments being presented by parties. Our assessment to date of the NDCs that were submitted in advance of Glasgow would indicate that we're on track for a temperature increase of greater than 2 degrees. It's an improvement from what we were projecting at the point of the adoption of the Paris Agreement, but still not enough to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement and the need to ensure that the world is resilient to those impacts. Noting that the greater the level of mitigation that we have, the lower the need to adapt and create enhanced resilience for vulnerable communities. And so the aim of each COP in the future, and I guess the move over time from a COP that was focused on the negotiation of the general framework up to 2015, and then the rules around that framework over the last number of COPs, we're going to see a shift in what the Conference of the Parties and the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement is designed to achieve. It's no longer about negotiating the individual provisions of the Paris Agreement, nor is it about naming and shaming individual countries, but about assessing how cooperation at the international level can drive greater ambition and faster implementation that allows us to achieve those dual objectives. And that is mainly enshrined in the global stocktake process, a 5-year process that is enshrined in the Paris Agreement to look at the collective progress, and that would inform parties' ongoing updates to their NDCs and their national climate policies. And the global stocktake is facilitating an assessment of collective progress across all those thematic areas, not just achieving the 1.5 goal as a mitigation target, but also adaptation and resilience and the provision of support from developed to developing countries, and the broader mobilization of means of implementation to allow the goals of the Paris Agreement to be achieved. The global stocktake is designed to complete its work before the beginning of each new cycle of NDCs. So we will complete the global stocktake next year in Dubai at COP28. It's an ongoing technical process at the moment to collect that information and provide the political process at COP28 with an updated assessment of where we stand in relation to all these areas of mitigation, adaptation, and means of implementation. That dialogue started in our subsidiary body sessions here in Bonn in June this year, will continue in Sharm el Sheikh and through June next year in technical dialogues, and result in a political outcome in COP28 next year. We already acknowledge, however, in Glasgow that we already know that the NDCs are insufficient to achieve the 1.5 degree goal, and so there has been a request coming from Glasgow to all parties to already update their NDCs, and we're starting to see NDCs come in, national joint contributions, revised levels of ambition coming in over the last number of months, with a request from the Secretariat that enhanced NDCs would be submitted by September 23rd of this year. On youth in the UNFCCC process, so youth is a cross-cutting element of our action for climate empowerment, which looks at education, public awareness, training, public participation, and public access to information. A 10-year work program for action for climate empowerment was adopted in Glasgow to launch a decade of youth empowerment. And the ACE action plan is under negotiation. Negotiations on that launched at the subsidiary body sessions here in June, and expected to be adopted at COP27, which will create a stronger framework for youth engagement across the full action agenda for the UNFCCC process. I want to briefly touch also on gender under the UNFCCC process, and recognizing that climate impacts and the impacts on vulnerable communities also impact pre-existing inequalities in the world, including gender equality. And this has been a process that's been ongoing for, again, many, many years under the UNFCCC process, starting very much looking inward at the representation and participation of women in the UNFCCC process and the imbalance that was there in national delegations and negotiators, which then was reflected in the outcomes that are not necessarily gender balanced. Paris Agreement adopted much stronger human rights language on capacity building and adaptation and recognizing the need for a gender responsive approach to climate action, which resulted also in a 3-year work program being adopted in 2019, up to 2019, and a gender action plan then adopted at the Madrid COP in 2019, which is currently under review and running up to 2024. And again, this is much more outward facing, as I said in the opening remarks, that we have a process which is moving not just towards the intergovernmental negotiations, but also how that informs action at different levels, at the regional level, at the national level, at subnational and community levels. And so the Gender Action Plan is much more focused on ensuring gender responsive budgeting and ensuring inclusion of women and girls in decision-making processes related to climate action. And that particularly not just how we're reducing our emissions, but also how we're ensuring that communities are resilient to climate action in a gender responsive manner is critically important. And I guess I would add that youth is particularly important in ensuring that these intended approaches from the intergovernmental process are then reflected in reality in how action is taken and how action is planned for at the national and subnational levels. Briefly touching on COP27 and the vision for the Egyptian presidency is focused on mitigation, adaptation, and finance, and ensuring that the pledges across all these areas that have been made, pledges and commitments made both by national governments, but also subnational actors and by private sector are delivered on, and to create a moment for accountability. And I think this is critically important as we move from Glasgow, the conclusion of the Paris Agreement rulebook on markets, on transparency, into into COP28, where we'll have the global stocktake. That COP27 marks a moment where there is transparency and accountability for the pledges that have already been made, and moving from pledges into projects and action. And that movement from pledges to project and action, of course, requires all stakeholders to be fully engaged. Private sector, youth, and civil society are fully engaged in driving that action, in determining the nature and forms of action that will address not just climate change, but also address the other sustainable development goals in a complementary manner. In terms of the expected topics and outcomes for COP27, as indicated before, we have a call for all parties to submit enhanced climate action plans, both short-term NDCs and long-term low-emission development strategies in advance of COP27, with a deadline of September this year. The aim would be that, again, COP would, and the CMA under the Paris Agreement would review that and see the progress being made. We're not going to close the gap between the NDCs pre-Glasgow and the 1.5 goal in 1 year. So this is the start of a process, but ensuring that that process is delivering and that ratchet mechanism is delivering year on year, and that goal is being achieved, particularly as the costs of not responding to climate change are being more visible year on year, and the costs of addressing climate change are falling year on year. And we ensure that we're not locking in high emission development pathways or locking in high emission infrastructure in the coming decade. Adaptation and loss and damage will clearly be a critical issue for the COP this year. The institutional arrangements on loss and damage for the Santiago network, but also advancing the work on the Glasgow dialogues on loss and damage and ensuring adequate financing to address the impacts of climate change and the loss and damage that is already being experienced, and work on defining a global goal for adaptation and ensuring that is human-centered and justice-centered will be a priority for many parties at COP27, and a priority that I think youth stakeholders, both as negotiators and as activists, can contribute to, ensuring that a people-centered and a justice-centered approach to the definition of resilience and adaptation. Non-party stakeholders will be engaged throughout the process, not just as actors, but also as activists, and ensuring that our aim is to ensure that we have an inclusive COP and an inclusive multilateralism. We don't believe in this phase of implementation of Paris Agreement that it is possible to achieve our established goals by just having negotiation. That involves engaging actors in defining the trajectory for that action and engaging actors in the implementation of that action to result in a socially just transformation in line with the 1.5 degree goal, because not all pathways to achieving the 1.5 degree goal will result in social justice. And it's important that those dimensions are also considered at the intergovernmental level, but also at the national level. On finance, I guess there's three different strands of this: a concrete timelines and deadlines for achieving the long promised 100 billion, which was originally committed to at the COP in Copenhagen for 2020, and the importance of trust building of achieving that goal, a definition of a new quantitative goal for finance mobilization, both in terms of support, but wider alignment of financial flows with the aims of the Paris Agreement. And lastly, ensuring that finance is equally distributed to adaptation and resilience priorities and not solely focused on achieving emission reductions and the 1.5 degree goal. So whirlwind through the background and focus for the coming year. And yeah, very happy, Stephanie, to take questions from the audience now or at the end of the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Connor. If anybody has questions, please don't forget to put them in the Q&A session part of the Zoom link. It's right in the text bar below. So you can just type your questions in there, save them for the end of the session. So thank you very much, Connor. Our very, very next speaker is one that's going to speak to us on climate finance. She is in the person of Miss Winnie Mutaya at the African Development Bank. She is the climate change readiness expert to the Green Climate Fund program. Her task is to provide policy and technical support to countries in developing their own country readiness program. That is an enabler to them mobilizing resources from the Green Climate Fund. She supports country-driven initiatives to strengthen their institutional capacities. Ms. Mutaya is a Kenyan, and she is a female Kenyan awardee of the DAAD German in-country full scholarship. She has a master's in research and public policy from the Egerton University, Kenya. She has also a degree from Hamburg as well, and in the university in Germany. She's also a Kenyan University of Agriculture and Technology graduate, where she successfully completed her studies in November of 2015. Ms. Mutaya recently finished a course in climate governance, diplomacy and negotiations leadership program by the African Group of Negotiations Expert Support. She is an in-country level support to the global level, offering services to humanity, and she works with youth at the Rotary International. Can we kindly welcome Ms. Winnie Mutaya of the African Development Bank? Over to you, Ms. Winnie.
Hi, thank you so much, Stephanie, for the nice introduction. It's a really good pleasure to be here and to just represent the bank and to give a perspective on what you mean by climate finance, where we are at and where we are headed. So I'll quickly go into the discussion and probably to introduce what really do we mean by climate finance and why is it important, and what is the general role of financial sector when it comes to just climate action. So I'll start with, when we really talk about climate finance, we as a bank are really committed, and one of our goals is to make 40% of our administrative and program operations to be climate finance. We realize there's so much work to be done on that, and so we have partnered with Green Climate Fund. And so what we do is we really support countries in developing what we call a readiness program. And a readiness program is really just geared towards strengthening the capacity of countries to be able not only to prepare proposals, but also to prepare their capacity and understanding on how to mobilize climate finance resources. So I serve the Lusophone countries, and the Lusophone countries are our pilot countries in the readiness program. We signed a master agreement with the Green Climate Fund. And so far, we've been able to really mobilize 540 million USD for countries, and we do co-financing. So for every project that gets to succeed within the GCF, we do co-financing with them. So I'll quickly go into what we have realized so far working with countries in terms of the readiness program and what is the gap. And so one of the things that has come uniquely, and one as a bank, we are really supporting COP27. And so one of the things that came out, we are engaging in 3 levels within the COP27. So one, we are engaging with the host country, Egypt, and supporting them in terms of technical capacity, and also just operationally in terms of to support the establishment and the movement of COP27. 2, we are doing what we call engaging CSO. And so we have a really robust CSO engagement. And actually on exactly, I think it's we have a civil society forum that we are naming it Engaging Civil Society for Climate Resilient and Just Energy Transition in Africa, that is going to take part in 6th to 7th October, this in 1 month time. And the focus of this would be just to how do we engage CSOs ahead of COP27? What's the conversation that needs? And we are focusing in terms of knowledge production, in terms of financing, and in terms of what do we mean by climate justice and climate transition when it comes to civil society. And the third we are doing is we are enhancing the capacity of countries to be able to negotiate. And so we feel like, and this is our thought, that looking ahead, this could be the first COP in Africa, but this places us in a position to be able to advocate for issues robustly now that it's happening on Africa. And for the first time, we have an opportunity to really focus on us and really look integrally what really do we need for Africa. So these are the 3 levels in which we are engaging and supporting COP27 as a bank. And we, of course, are leading in what we call the Africa Pavilion, which will be a stage to showcase solutions for Africa and what that does look like for when it comes to the green economy. So that's really would be one of the things I would want to highlight. The other great thing you would wish to look ahead is in terms of climate financing. One of the important things we will be launching at COP27 as a bank is you would be launching a program that is aimed at greening the financial ecosystem. So we will be, for the first time, bringing all the banks and all the insurance services together and designing a program where we do technical capacity building on what does it look like if we are going to build a really green economy for Africa. What does that mean for banks and financial institutions? So that's something, a program we will be launching at COP27, and one that we will see many partners coming on board, and GCF has come on board to support the bank on that. But moving away from that, I would now go into the nitty-gritties of what is the general role of financial sector. So when it comes to the financial sector, and we as a bank, there is what we categorize as the public sector and the private sector. And I think the biggest question has been, how do you really, first of all, incentivize, and how do you harness resources from the public sector to be able to transform and to be able to address climate issues? And so what we do as a bank currently within the Readiness Program, we take seriously stakeholder engagement processes, and every proposal that we support, from the design to mobilization of resources to implementation, we are very key to country assessment needs. So we just don't design proposals, we ensure that there is a country needs assessment that has been done that will inform the the development of that particular proposal. But also now we are assisting countries to really develop what we call a climate rationale. So as they mobilize resources from countries, what we call climate justification, and what I mean by that is from a climate perspective and from a climate crisis and climate change issue, how does the project you're trying to develop address the current climate change issue? And so we are really training countries to develop that in terms of how to just even write the narrative. And then 3, we are focusing on gender awareness and how, and that's really a huge gap we are facing currently in many countries. So what we are trying now, and for now and the larger part of last year and this year, we've done a lot of sensitization on what gender analysis from a climate perspective looks like. And that is a really key requirement when you're trying to mobilize financial resources. I really need to mention this, that as we went through, one of the common things that came was, how do we engage young people in terms of climate change operations within countries? There was really that huge gap. And we realized it could be the advocacy and it could be the level of awareness. And these two are things we keep grappling. And the level of awareness from the managerial to the top leadership level of the country, to the middle and to the lower, there's really lack of information on how to engage on climate issues. What does it mean? Many times we don't have figures on the table, and we've had to reach out to the regional climate centers to be able to provide climate data that would be important to inform decision making and policy makers. So by the time a country reaches out and says we need this amount of resources, there's a lot of justification we get countries in terms of gender, in terms of country needs assessment, in terms of climate rationale. But also the other thing we try guide countries is to look within the policies that they have. Do they have a regulatory framework that supports the kind of green economy they are building? And that's something we are really trying to insist on that. So we look back at the climate policies that are in place and where is the gap, and we try to fit into that. The other question I would want to address is, how is the international climate finance organized within the UNFCCC structure? So within the UNFCCC structure, we have 2 operations. We have the Global Environmental Facility that was set in operation from 1994, and then we have the Green Climate Fund, which came in operation since COP16. So those 2, and I mean, we have other financial instruments. I might not exhaust all of them, but I will share a link in which you can read. But apart from that, we actually have special funds. So we have the Special Climate Change Fund, and we have the Least Development Countries Fund, both managed by the GEF under the Adaptation Fund. And to really add on that, the bank has also come up with an adaptation acceleration program. And so we really are focusing, and we're really trying to see how we can support countries both from adaptation and mitigation issue. But the key thing here is we are really focusing now on adaptation, because it's a rallying call, although we still strive to create a balance. But I think adaptation financing has a huge gap, and we are really focusing on that currently. And going into COP27, we are pressing the need that we need to scale adaptation financing as a focus in this COP27. And of interest would be, I think there's an adaptation conference that the bank, we are co-chairing, and this will happen in September, and that is by the GCA Global Center for Adaptation. And the focus is, how do we scale up adaptation financing, and how do we get this conversation ahead of COP27. So that would be one of the conferences that would probably highlight that the young people could look forward. We have a youth forum ahead of the Global Center for Adaptation. We have a youth forum focusing on adaptation finance and how the young people could tap into that. It's on September 5th. So you could look into that. It starts from September 3rd to September 5th in Rotterdam, Netherlands. That could be a really important way in which young people could tap in terms of the adaptation conversation and how they could engage in ahead of COP27. The other important matter that I need to touch on is why and what are the points of conflict in international climate finance. So really the contentions, really what we've come to realize is really for us, there's a common understanding and a common goal that we really need to scale up mobilization of climate finance. But we have to do that, identifying that we are all starting from a different capacity and from a different zone. And we have to do it respectively and in a responsible manner. So who is to take the share is what is still a problem. And I think one of the things as I help countries is some countries don't have what we call national climate funds. And so that in itself is a highlight of how much climate has not been a focus in terms of just mobilizing finances. And so we are trying to help countries right now that I might not mention to really set up a climate national fund. And this would be a journey for them to be able to understand why really it's important to have a budget geared towards climate national fund. And what we are trying to do, we are trying to blend both public and private investments into this climate national fund so that we don't take the larger shareholding. But also when I really talk about how can really the private sector be involved, we're looking at how do they buy stakes and shares when it comes to private farms that are energy centric, and how do we shift to renewable sources of energy? How do we invest in green private investments? And so one of the things, we have a forum, and I'm also going to share, and probably this might be of interest to many young people, especially entrepreneurs, that's happening also in this September 14th to 15th that we're really taking part. And this is probably just for information awareness going ahead of COP. And we are calling it the Green Climate Fund Private Investment Forum. It's totally free. You can go hybrid. It will be a hybrid forum. And the Private Investment Forum is, for the first time, we are discussing how do we bring private investment into green climate issues, you know, and how do we actually bring the conversation of how do we involve private sector into climate change issues. And the forum is taking place on September 13th to 15th. And so you could look at it, and it's just then the Private Investment Climate Forum by the Green Climate Fund. So you could look at it, and they have also a session on young entrepreneurs engaging in it. So it could be a focus you could look at in case anyone is interested in it in the Green Climate Fund. And I hope that would surface a very great information for all of you. And then also maybe the other thing I would really wish to add in terms of how can young people get funding? And I know that funding is really quite a challenge. So I would really probably highlight a number of areas into which you could grasp. So right now we are engaging with CSOs, and PASJ is one of them. And so I probably will share with UNIDO after that forum on October on probably possible funding areas that we will be availing for young people to come and explore how their participation in Egypt. The other thing I would reach out to is probably also another innovative way we've seen is getting to what you call joint initiatives and approaching institutions that are geared towards financing. And so if you come as a group and you're a young entrepreneurs and you really have justification on how you're really organizations that you are really running are engaged in climate issues, that could be another way that we could do co-financing and say we could cover half of this trip and half of this. So that could be interesting to explore. But more so specifically because we are categorizing youth engagement under the CSO engagement. So I would get back on that, especially on which are the funding portfolios and areas we would be availing for young people to join us in COP27, and I will share as the days goes by with the focal points. And then lastly, just is transition to how can we make sure the climate finance promotes climate justice. I mean, there is a balance in terms of we are just not in the business of mobilizing resources. We are in the business of creating a sustainable society. And that was a really huge call in terms of how do we just not mobilize resources, but ensure that we are doing it in a sustainable manner. So for us, how we do it is information is key, knowledge production is key. So currently we are trying to generate a number of knowledge production and resources that offer solutions that could be replicated elsewhere. So we are trying to tap into that, so that any decisions that different countries make, they could be able to rely on solutions that other countries have made. So we realize there's a really huge gap in terms of solutions and knowledge sharing of countries in terms of how to address climate crisis. And so that's something we are focusing on in terms of a knowledge hub production. The other thing we are trying to engage is technology. And I know the challenge of technology is the challenge we have is so huge, but technology requires you to test it before and pilot it before it's utilized. So for us, the biggest challenge is how do you reduce that period of piloting and testing technology that could serve an impact in the climate change. So we are currently engaging with various technology solution companies in Africa to see how do we reduce the window period of testing, but also how do we design products, and this I mean technological products that are able to address the issues in energy and agriculture, because the largest two areas when it comes to climate change are agriculture and energy. So I think we are trying to do our best, but climate financing at the basic of it all, no matter how many solutions we have, financiers have to be on board. And so as we gear for COP27, our focus is how to scale up adaptation financing, but also how do we localize the knowledge? How do we engage young, not only young people, but also local knowledge? That's the focus we have for now. And probably the last thing I would love to highlight that probably I would wish to engage the young people is we have engaged with the World Meteorological Organization and GCA and GCF and the bank to create a network, and this network is focused on building climate science information. And so we would be having our first forum side event at COP27. I would love to have some of you there as I'm coordinating. And the really idea of the network is just to see how do we scale up information, climate information in Africa, and how do we use the climate information to inform decision making, and also how do we use this climate information to develop more entrepreneurs, and so that with the information and the gap we see, we develop solutions that create employment. So we'll have that session, and it will be a whole day session at COP27. So I would really be glad to engage some of you in it. So I will be sharing a whole of this information after this session, and hopefully I could see many of you towards COP27. So I think that's it for now. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Willie. That was so power-packed, and there's a lot that went into that. So hopefully during my brief of all of it, I'll be able to mention some of it further. I have seen that a lot of people have questions in the Q&A session, but because we are holding it all off for the end, we will ask you to kindly hold on. But when you are addressing the questions, please address it to the respective person that you'd want to answer the question, so it's easy to delineate. So our next speaker is our very own honorable member of parliament of the Egyptian parliament, Ms. Amira Saba. Ms. Amira Saba is an Egyptian She's an Egyptian member of parliament serving as the Secretary General of the House Foreign Relations Committee. She is the VP of the Egyptian Social Democratic Party responsible for planning and development. She's a member of the Egypt's Coordinating Committee of Parties, Youth Leaders, and Politicians. She concurrently serves as an appointed member of Egypt's Supreme Council of Culture. Inside the parliament, Ms. Amira has submitted tens of legislative and oversight tools pushing for human-centered development and progressive agenda. She holds an MA in Development Studies from the University of Sussex, where she was awarded a Chevening Scholarship. She holds an MBA from Escala Business School. She has a BSc in Biochemistry from Egypt. Ms. Amira was appointed to the board of the National Unity Committee, which has the mandate to oversee a national dialogue between the government and the opposition. This should reveal to us as a testament of Ms. Amira's broad appeal and political standing. Please welcome Ms. Amira to speak to us on the role of the African continent in mitigation and adaptation of climate change. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much for the beautiful introduction, and thank you for this event. I got actually lots of very valuable insights from all of the speakers, and thanks to all the organizers of the event. It's my utmost pleasure to join you in this meeting and present to you in the next few minutes the case of climate change and climate response in Africa using Egypt and its climate change strategy as a case study. As we know, Africa contributes negligibly to climate change, yet it remains the most vulnerable region worldwide because of decades long of low levels of socio-economic development. Africans know how devastating climate change can be to other countries. Natural disasters weren't kind to Africans. Countries like Kenya, Mozambique, and South Africa, for example, have experienced in the past 2 decades tens of storms, droughts, and flooding. Also, the food crisis there in Africa is the worst, specifically as the situation sharpens after COVID and definitely after the Ukrainian-Russian war. So the UN estimates that 346 million people already face food insecurity. Water scarcity as well is another massive problem affecting nearly each country, including mine, Egypt. And Africans have survived and are still struggling against armed conflict, which has deprived them from resources, and they don't want climate change to exacerbate the dire situation there. That's why 54 countries, basically I think all the African countries, have ratified Paris Agreement and are bound to implement their own nationally determined contributions, their NDCs, and national adaptation plans. Many African states have taken innovative actions against climate change, from South Africa's carbon tax to Morocco's solar facilities to attracting foreign direct investments in clean energy, like in Nigeria. It's a difficult task to capture all the African efforts actually in details. And in that regard, I just focus on my country, Egypt, which will represent definitely the entire continent next November, and we welcome you all, but also has come a long way actually of investing in legislations, projects, and international advocacy work for climate action. At the onset, let me emphasize that climate action in Egypt doesn't start with the 2050 climate change strategy that was revealed lately in 2022 and undoubtedly doesn't end with it. Egypt has had its fair share in climate action, from a high-level political commitment to an institutional and policy framework. Just give highlights of some past and ongoing actions. This includes laws. We have Law 72 for the year 2017 on investment, Law 102 for the year 1986 on establishing the new and renewable energy authority, Law 4 for the year 1994 on environment, and actually many other laws. The recent of them, which I think would add a lot to our fight towards climate change, is a bill which I actually submitted to the parliament to combat food waste. And I think food waste is has a lot to do with climate change issue, That's because all the emissions from the food process, from the food manufacturing process, could be actually minimized when we rationalize our food usage and rationalize the food waste. Also, we have presidential decrees and ministerial decrees, for example, restricting on importing coal, incentivizing renewable energy, establishing and reforming several climate-related bodies. And for the international law and instruments ratification, ratified Paris Agreement, Vienna Convention for Protection of the Ozone, UNFCCC, Kyoto Protocol, and others. For the projects for adaptations, green economy, and sustainable transportations, there are really mega projects on all of these aspects. And for the institutions we mandated with climate action, like the National Council for Climate Action. For the policies and strategies, we just released the 2050 National Climate Change Strategy and also the Disaster Risk Reduction and the 2018 Low Emission Development Strategy. So for the 2050 strategy, there comes as the culmination of Egypt's commitment to a timely response to the climate disaster. It's a kind of a roadmap guiding the national efforts to reduce green gas emissions. And it was very much needed in order to have a basic common reference for the policymakers, the citizens, the international community to monitor Egypt's progress towards the nationally identified goals. The strategy comes in a 57-page and with 22 objectives and main 5 goals. I'll go straight forward to goal 4, which I think is the top important issue which shall be discussed in COP27, which is enhancing climate financing infrastructure. Each of these goals is supported by a number of objectives and strategic directions, and inside each goal, the strategy performs a kind of a SWOT analysis, focusing on the risks and the potential of each goal. So for the goal 4, which provides a numbers of tools for its implementation, it's subdivided into directions, which are kind of general cross-cutting tools that are advised for the implementation of the goal financing. For example, providing green financing to SMEs, increase climate and environmental risk assessments as well in financing. And for the performance indicators, this comes such as the percentage of investment directed to climate sector, percentage of resources allocated from the state budget to climate change, percentage of private sector investment in climate projects, ratio of climate financing directed to SMEs, and the volume of international climate finance allocated to Egypt. Also, it comes with some enabling policies and tools, which includes suggested prime ministerial decisions, creating needed forms and reports. It also suggested engagements with stakeholders, mainly the banking sectors, to establish relevant committees, partnerships, and capacity building. The strategy further suggests also kind of a biennial M&E mechanism where ministries will report on the status of identifies and adaptation actions which is provided in the strategy. Way ahead to this, actually, on this note, and that we are talking about youth and that I represent youth in the parliament, in the climate parliament, and in the national dialogue, which is currently running in Egypt. I have attended the last COP as Scotland, and I wasn't very pleased with the minimal participation of women and youth. And I'm still very unpleased with how serious the voices of the youth are taken into consideration, with how many, and in terms of quantity and quality of them are really engaged in the formulation of the policies in their countries and even on the national scene. On this note, actually, I call for a youth action for climate change during the upcoming COP. Youth-led and youth-focused organizations should take the stage and they should channel their voices more. Also, policymakers, they have an ethical and legal obligations to listen to the youth voices. When we talk youth, we talk about one of the largest strata of the world's population. They are one of the fastest growing ones, and they have the longest time span to live on Earth. and yet they are still the most vulnerable to global shocks, and they are the most unheard. I can't actually separate this from the consequences of the 2008 financial crisis, which still had its impact on the millennials' employability years after the market crash. The COVID-19, it interrupted youth learning, development, employability for years, as you have all attested. So when youth suffer in one aspect of their lives, like education, for example, this affects their health, their work, their mental capacities. And it traps them in a kind of a poverty trap, which also drags along their children and their ability to make decisions that are meaningful to their lives in their communities. So actually climate change, if it is not less of a threat, it is the utmost threat which I see nowadays, and which actually with every single aspect of reason affects youth and their future for years to come. So if it didn't, the climate change in a total climate apocalypse, youth at the very least will suffer horrendously for generations to come. When I call for engaging youth, I don't suggest only making youth passive recipients by teaching them on climate change. This is important. It happens in universities, it happens in the public space, but I actually call for their meaningful participation in policy making. If you're not part of shaping the policy, then your voice is not well heard. Also, the experience from several parliaments around the world, it gives me a very clear image that the world attests the young MPs, they tend to raise the issue of climate change much more than their fellow adults inside the legislative halls. Same happens in Egypt, actually, and I think it's happening everywhere in the world. So their voices count, and their implementation of legislative impact is very important when we talk about climate action. In my capacity, actually, as a member of the Egyptian parliament representing the youth constituency in Egypt, I stand for youth participation in climate action, and I do invite all youth listening to read the climate strategy and to reach out to me after the event today with any suggestions for climate action. I'm very keen to take this to the Parliament Hall, to even inspire and actions in Africa, and to learn from the experiences of drafting laws and legislations which do fight climate change actively and which could really contribute to this issue positively and effectively. Thank you for your kind listening, and I'm very open to any questions.
Thank you so much, Honorable. So you have said a lot, an intense movement, and one of the most important things that I've taken away from all the important things you've said, especially, is that we need a lot of meaningful youth engagement, one that moves and shakes things, not just educating, but is present in decision making. So from there, I'm going to go to the Q&A session. So thank you all to our very esteemed panelists and speakers. We are going to move on towards our Q&A session. So our very first question in the Q&A is going to go to Con. And the question was stated by a fellow participant even before he started speaking. So I'm going to read it out briefly so that he can answer this briefly for us. The question here is, sorry, give me a minute. Perfect. The question here is, the person thinks that, in their opinion, that goal 13 is not a precise target. What is the exact level of awareness targeted to be reached? The statement of the goal 13.3 is to improve education, awareness raising, and human and institutional capacity on climate change mitigation, adaptation, impact reduction, and early warnings. Dr. Mariam Farouk asked this question. She's wondering whether it's an exact target and what is the exact level of awareness targeted to be reached for this goal. Connor?
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie, and thanks for the question. Firstly, I guess we have a challenge between goal 13 in the SDGs and the UNFCCC process, because they were both being negotiated simultaneously. So the SDGs were adopted as just a couple of months before the Paris Agreement was adopted. And the overarching recognition in Goal 13 in the SDGs is that international action on climate change would be driven through the UNFCCC process and the outcomes that ultimately were the Paris Agreement. And so that makes elements of Goal 13 perhaps a little bit more vague than some of the other goals, because the detail is then contained in the Paris Agreement. And I think in relation to education, training, public awareness, it is difficult to have specified, quantified goals for what level of awareness that we're talking about, and particularly what level of training. And Tariq mentioned this in terms of the evolution of awareness and the evolution of training from when he was originally in education and through his career. And we're seeing now across the world a generation of youth coming out with a clear understanding of the impacts of climate change and curriculum that account for climate issues. We also see that the knowledge on this is evolving. When we were negotiating the Paris Agreement, the sense was that 1.5 degrees would be a highly ambitious outcome. But if we look at the IPCC 1.5 report and AR6, 1.5, yes, it's very, very difficult to achieve, but it's also touching on that dangerous interference with the climate system. So we have to also have an accommodation of how knowledge evolves, and ensuring that we're not locking in awareness of the problem as it stood 2 years ago, and that we have a kind of continuous campaign of information to ensure that people have access to the most up-to-date information, rather than a lock-in to science as understood 3-4 years in the past, because this area is going to evolve. I think I also answered to one of the questions in the chat on this in terms of the differentiated impacts, because the disaster risk reduction avoidance and differentiated impacts and the impacts at a regional level or a subnational level or a local level will be significantly different across the globe. And having a global campaign for information about climate change, which looks at a kind of generic impacts of climate change, will be quite different to the localized impacts in particular regions. So we also need to tailor the information to ensure that local communities are having information about the impacts that they will face, crop changes that might need to take place, water management changes that need to take place. They're all very much driven at a local and subnational level, and the information that is given to citizens needs to be consistent with that challenge.
Thank you very much, Connor. I think our next question goes to Winnie. The question says that are there real opportunities for having international financing for developing countries and transfer of actual technologies to them to achieve what was agreed upon at COP26 through COP27 in light of the current circumstances of the repercussions of matters between Russia, Ukraine, and the US and Japan, which affects all countries all over the world? So any of you can answer this question, but I think it's more specific to Winnie.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think there are, and one of the things we've had to relook. So we how we do it is you look at the pipeline of investment and you look at the projections of the funding that are coming through in relation to different countries, and so what we do, because we really have an agreement, the Green Climate Fund and the Africa Development Bank. So what we look at the whole pipeline and so much of the donor funding we have received in terms of addressing climate issues. And then we sit back and look, and technology is one of the key demands, I must agree. And I said for us, the challenge is there's so much innovations coming up. The question is the sustainability of the innovation. And so what we are doing now is we are trying to engage bilaterally with different innovators depending on the pipeline, whether it's agriculture, whether it's energy. And we are trying to work on reducing the piloting and the testing period, because then we don't want to invest in a technology we haven't, first of all, tested and tried it. One, but also we want to invest in a technology that we could replicate it. So it's an ongoing conversation. And again, before introducing technological innovations, there's so much regulatory framework that is different for each country. And so for us to be able to help countries, we now try and adopt technology that could, and so how we do it is we combine projects per country. So we don't develop bilaterally projects in one country. So we do projects and programs that require innovations, and we do it as a set of countries. This enables efficiency for us, cost effectiveness, but also what this enables us is it cuts the regulatory framework for us, because if you were to test the product using the regulatory framework from different countries, it would be hard. So as I say, technology is needed. And I think there's an article I would share by UNCTAD in terms of technology that is required for the current climate change crisis. What is the gap? And so one of the things UNCTAD mentioned is financing for technology could be a challenge. That is one, in terms of how do we assess as innovators finances for technology. And sometimes it's not even the finances. How do you assess the doors and opportunities to be able to fund you? That's always a huge gap. And so information is key, and we are trying to put out information and calls, but also we are working internally as a bank to be able to really be innovative and open doors for more innovators. And we are trying, I think, we are coming up, it hasn't been launched, but it's still over, an opportunity where we are going to bring innovators and young innovators, and young, I think it's up to 34, to showcase, and this would be yearly in terms of the innovations. We are working on the dynamics of that. Once it's out, I will share. For now, it's not yet out, but we are really working on it. We are not doing well, but it's a process at a time. So I really hope I try to answer that question. It's a very tricky question because the challenge is always financing innovation, and which is a big challenge. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Winnie. While I have you, somebody wants to know about the exact roles that the banking sector can play with regards to green financing and sustainable environment, and how we can see that in practice.
Okay, so that's really good. So let me just check something quicker here within me, and so what we are doing is when we talk about greening the financial ecosystem, what we are trying to do, so we will use, we wouldn't be the direct entity, so we'll use an entity that we are still trying to select that will do the compilation of all insurance services, and the person asking this could get in touch with me individually. It's really fine. And so what we are trying to do is, one, have an engagement with all insurance banks within Africa, and so if it's creating subsidies, because subsidies could be the challenge here when we are trying to revamp the whole financial ecosystem towards a green. But the challenge for us now is technical capacity building and knowledge awareness. That is, first of all, the biggest lack for us that we see in many companies and banks and insurance services that we have engaged in. And so the program will be, I say, the key program will be launching at COP, but I will share more on that also once we firm up and the concept note and what young insurance people interested in that could be engaged. But if you're planning to come on COP, definitely you will have an insight on that. But it would be focused a lot on knowledge engagement for the first 3 years, and how do you also bring insurance services together that are really, really interested in addressing and reporting on sustainability issues. How do we train it? So for now, we figured out the first phase will be on capacity building, and we will do it continuously. So we will have many sessions on that. And that's something the person could engage with me bilaterally, but that's something we're working on.
Thank you so much. One last question and we end the Q&A session. So a lot of people are very interested. I think this question goes to both you, Winnie, and Corner, and then Honorable Amar, because they're interested in how they as youth can be able to participate in the COP effectively, one. And I think you mentioned something on funding as well. They want to be able to understand how they can get some funding for it as well and get accreditation for this, so that they're able to be well represented at the forum. You can start, Winnie. You can start. Then
Okay.
Connor will say something and Mr. Mura will say something.
Yeah, it's very tricky for the bank. Currently, we don't have a youth funding for that. I must be honest. We are working on the dynamics, and so we thought to engage the young people under the CSO framework, but it's something we will probably have a discussion ahead of the civil society forum on how to engage young people. But directly we don't have, because, and in terms of accreditation, we are providing and funding through country engagements, and so we have representatives from ministry that we are funding. So then we would rely much on the ministry to be able to nominate the person, and not us necessarily nominating the young person. That's very different. But we are going to have an engagement, a discussion on that. And once we have funding opportunities available, I'll definitely be able to share and keep in touch with UNIDO on that, especially after our civil society forum engagement. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Winnie. Connor, can you take a few minutes to talk about that as well?
Yeah, it's an ongoing challenge that we have. Firstly, I guess in general with participation in the COP. So let's start with what the COP is, which is an intergovernmental oversight body for the implementation of the Paris Agreement and the convention. Of course, in addition to that, it is, you know, the largest convening moment for action on climate change simultaneously. And of course, there is desire for participation in both aspects of that. One as observers to the negotiation process, where people can provide input to that. As a UN process, we have a formal process for the admission of observer organizations that have an interest in contributing to the implementation of the convention. We have over 3,000 observer organizations that are admitted. And so that becomes particularly challenging given the scale of a venue and allowing access to a negotiation site. So admission is always a challenge. So I would first, and then youth participation cuts across different dimensions. I think there is youth participation within delegations, national delegations, and the national delegation is free to propose as many attendees as they would like. That can be as contributors or overflow to the party delegation as advisors. It can also be as junior civil servants within the delegation. So youth cuts across that. We also then have youth activists as part of NGO constituencies, and UNICEF do also bring quite a few youth and children into the process. I would definitely say we need to do better on consolidating the information about the different organizations that offer funding and support. Because many organizations are offering funding and support, not enough, clearly. And that's the issue with funding for everything, never enough. But I think we are working to ensure that there would be more clarity on who is offering funding and how that can be accessed. Will still always be a challenge, but I think the access to the information on that, I think, is currently lacking, and is a task for us as a secretariat to improve the quality of access to information on funding sources, so that people know where to apply, even if the pool is more limited than the number of applicants. So that's something we'll work on in the coming months. Not sure we'll solve it entirely for COP27, but something we certainly hope to solve for COP28.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Honorable Amar, can you take up a few words maybe on how the Egyptian government is helping in this regard? Honorable Amira?
Would you just kindly repeat the question quickly?
Okay. Could you take up a few words on how the Egyptian government is helping with the youth participation funding, accreditation, and delegation?
Yes. Actually, as per my knowledge, there has been lots of organizations which tackle the small projects, especially for the SMEs, all around the African continent. I can, if you have the emails of the participants, I can actually collect some of the links of these organizations and send them over later on. This is one thing. Another thing is that under the UNFCCC, there is the YOUNGO, there are certain entities which are only dedicated to the youth participation. So I so much encourage any of the youth hearing us now to contact these organizations to actually be part of the non-governmental organizations as well, because there is a quota for the civil society and for the NGOs to be present in COP. This is the things which I am actually sure of.
Thank you very much, Honorable Amira. I think we can take a few words from Dr. Sharifa as well on this particular topic. Dr. Sharifa. Can you hear me, Dr. Sharifa? Okay, we may have lost it a little bit there. So, okay, thank you very much to all our distinguished panel members. And we are very glad and esteemed at the knowledge you shared and impacted. You can see through the chats and the Q&A and how people are interacting, and I'm so glad that you shared what you shared. Most people have asked for the recordings, and some of a portion of the recording may be actually provided. We're working to make that possible for everyone, so you can benefit as and when you're done. Also, I'll share some light on how we can participate as young people before pre-COP, during COP, and then a little after COP. So before COP, we can be part of webinars like this to understand how the COP session works. We can get some knowledge and put ourselves in a position that we are quite learned and have some background to the things we say. We can advocate and push and put some heat on our governments and our institutions and private sector and big COP, so that they would also take very good initiatives. We can collaborate, and aside activism, we can collaborate with our fellow youth or fellow organizations or bigger organizations to make things happen, because most of the time, sometimes you don't have the funding, but they do, and they come together and make it work. As part of YOUNGO's initiative, YOUNGO, which I represent at the moment, we can also collaborate with people on performing the LCOIs. Most of the local conference on youths are happening during this period before November. We can just collaborate with them, apply to be delegates, apply to be supporting organizations in the countries. We are having a lot of regional COIs happening across the continents. We have the aim for COP for Africa and the Pacific and the likes. So we can also participate in the UNFCCC process to enhance it. Sometimes we might not be able to get there in person because we can't necessarily take the whole world to COP in that sense, but we can also be able to try and contribute as effectively as possible. And for funding organizations, some people are trying as hard as possible to support women, especially in representation. And some of the information that was shared here concerning the programs, I would highlight again, especially the ones that Winnie had shared during her presentation. She also shared a link in the chat box that you can register for the session on the 13th to 15th. She mentioned the GCA's initiative for youth between September 3rd to 5th. And she also mentioned a few gender packages. The Honorable Amira also mentioned that youth need to take initiative. So you can definitely take initiative. When you are at the COP, there are exhibitions and there are hosting session opportunities that you can also take advantage of when you're able to get accreditation to go to COP. And for the accreditation, most of the environmental protection agencies in your respective countries are able to help you with that. Some of they give us the national accreditation that Connor mentioned earlier. And so you can be able to benefit from that. You can also access a junior negotiator or a negotiator part of the national delegation. That is also possible if you haven't joined anyone already. And after COP, the job as you want to learn and partner and network as COP is to be able to come and take climate action after you are done. So you're not just going there to stir and be part of a process. You are going there to make an impact, be part of the things that are going on. You can also join YOUNGO, the United Nations official youth constituency as well, where we do a lot of impactful things, a lot of programs pre-COP, and follow us on our social media handles. So now, as I've said all this, I'm going to thank our partners for being so helpful. I'm going to thank the Climate Parliament. I'm going to thank the United Nations Industrial Development Organization for putting this together. I'm going to thank YOUNGO for helping put this together. I'm going to thank the National Institute of Governance and Sustainable Development, our astute panel, and the UNFCCC, everybody that I've missed out. Thank you so much for giving us such an opportunity as young people, and we appreciate it so much. We can also say thank you to the very team that organized this, from Katerina to everyone else, to Anna, to Isabella. We appreciate the work you've done to putting this together, and we're happy for you. And our esteemed panels, what would we have done without you? We appreciate you, your knowledge, your impact, and your drive is something that is really going a long way to affect us. So without much and no more to say, if there's no more that anyone wants to say, I thank our fellow audience, people that participated, for joining us and asking very relevant questions. We'll share the link and try to share the recordings as much as possible. So look out for these things as they come. Thank you very much, everyone. And have a good day, and keep impacting till and after COP27. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.